Imagine selling the one thing you love most, just to save someone you love even more. And then, watching an entire street fill with roaring Harleys because of it. That's exactly what happened to Walter Green. The rumble of a Harley-Davidson isn't just noise. It's a heartbeat, a memory, a story. And for Walter Green, 75 years old and still carrying the grit of a Vietnam veteran, that rumble had been the soundtrack of his freedom for decades. He had taken that bike across winding roads in Arizona, down to the crowded strips of Daytona Beach, and across the flat farmland of Indiana, where the horizon seemed endless. But now, in the middle of Dayton, Ohio, on a quiet street with cracked sidewalks and leaning mailboxes, Walter stood in his garage, staring at the one thing he swore he'd never part with. He rubbed a cloth slowly across the Harley's tank, the chrome reflecting his face like a mirror. The bike wasn't just metal and wheels. It was sweat, youth, and stories of men he served with who never made it home. And yet, he had no choice. "Granddad!" a small voice called from the doorway. It was Alyssa, his 12-year-old granddaughter. Her eyes were tired, shadows forming beneath them despite her age. The illness had taken away the easy laughter she once carried everywhere. She tugged at the sleeve of her sweatshirt, watching him. "You don't have to do this." Walter smiled, the kind of smile that tried to be strong but came with a weight behind it. "Baby girl," he said softly. "A motorcycle don't mean nothing compared to you. This bike has given me more than enough rides. Now it's your turn to get better." She walked into the garage, touching the bike's leather seat with her small hand. "But you love this Harley more than anything." He knelt down slowly, knees cracking, and put both hands on her shoulders. "Not more than you? Never more than you." There was a silence heavy enough to choke the room. Alyssa blinked hard, trying not to cry. She didn't want her grandfather to see her sadness. Walter pulled himself up and looked at the Harley again. The keys were already on the workbench, waiting. His hands shook slightly as he picked them up. For a man who had faced bullets, fire, and chaos in a war zone, nothing had ever been harder than letting go of this piece of his soul. Later that evening, he sat at his small kitchen table, pen in hand, staring at the classified ad he was about to send. His daughter, Alyssa's mother, had already taken a second job at a diner. The bills stacked higher every month. The insurance company kept denying coverage for the expensive treatment Alyssa needed. Walter had cashed what little savings he had left, sold off tools, even pawned his old medals. The Harley was the last thing, the last piece of himself he could trade for her chance at recovery. He sighed, pressing the pen down, and scribbled, "For sale. 2004 Harley-Davidson Road King. Excellent condition. Serious buyers only." The ad went live the next morning. By noon, he was in the garage again, wiping dust from the chrome, making sure every detail looked as perfect as possible. Alyssa sat nearby, sketching in her notebook, stealing glances at her grandfather when she thought he wasn't looking. "Who do you think will buy it?" she asked quietly. Walter exhaled. "Somebody who loves the road like I did. Somebody who'll take care of her. That's all I can ask." Alyssa shut her notebook and set it aside. "When I get better, can you promise me something?" "What's that, baby?" "Promise me you'll ride again, even if it's not this one. You should never stop riding." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He wanted to promise her, but his throat tightened. Instead, he reached across and took her hand. "We'll see. Right now, I'm just riding with you." That night, Walter didn't sleep. The glow from the streetlight poured faintly through the curtains as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the first day he bought the Harley, the roar of the engine beneath him, and how alive it made him feel. He thought about Alyssa, lying in her hospital bed, tubes connected to her arms, and how small she looked. The images twisted together until there was no separation between the two. The bike wasn't just freedom, it was her future now. But as he closed his eyes, another thought crept in. Selling the bike would give him money for the medicine, yes, but it also meant giving away the last piece of himself that made him feel like more than just an old man with bad knees. It was like handing over his heartbeat. He told himself it was worth it. He told himself she was worth it. And in his heart, he knew both were true. But when word of his sacrifice started to spread, things would take a turn Walter could never have predicted. The morning of the sale, Walter wheeled the Harley out of the garage like he had done 1,000 times before, but this time his hands felt heavy on the handlebars. The air was cool, and a thin mist still clung to the cracked pavement of Linden Avenue. He stood there for a moment, breathing it in, memorizing every detail: the faint smell of gasoline, the shine of the chrome, the way the seat creaked when he swung a leg over. Alyssa came out onto the porch, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. "You going for a ride, Granddad?" she asked, her voice still raspy from sleep. Walter adjusted his helmet, forcing a smile. "One more, baby girl. Just one more." She looked worried. "Don't go too far." He chuckled softly, though his chest felt tight. "Don't worry. I'll be back before your mama even finishes her shift." The Harley roared to life, the sound rolling through the neighborhood. Dogs barked down the street. A couple of curtains shifted as neighbors peeked out. Walter gave a quick wave to Alyssa and pulled away slowly, letting the engine warm beneath him. For a man his age, riding wasn't easy anymore. His knees stiffened, his back ached after too many miles. But when the wind hit his face, it was like stepping back in time. The years fell away, and for a fleeting moment, he was that young soldier again, home from Vietnam, clutching freedom with both hands as the road stretched endlessly before him. He took the long way through Dayton, weaving past the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, then onto the highway where the fields opened wide and the world seemed bigger than his problems. Cars zipped past, drivers glancing over at the sight of the older man in his leather jacket, patches stitched onto it from rides decades ago. Some honked in respect. Others just stared. Walter didn't care either way. He was listening to the road, to the engine, to his own heart keeping time with the machine. As the miles slipped under his tires, he remembered moments tied to this bike. Riding to Sturgis with his buddy Harold back in '89, when rain turned the road into a sheet of glass. The time Alyssa, just 6 years old, had begged for a ride around the block, her arms gripping his waist so tightly he laughed the entire way. He remembered his late wife, Denise, standing on the porch, shaking her head every time he came home covered in dust and bugs, pretending to be mad, but secretly smiling at the boyish gleam in his eyes. Each memory pressed down harder, reminding him what he was losing. This wasn't just steel and rubber. It was the vessel that had carried his life's best moments. At a gas station outside Springfield, Walter pulled over. He sat on the Harley, staring at the reflection in the side mirror. The lines on his face looked deeper today, as if each wrinkle had been carved by sacrifice. A man in his 30s stepped out of a pickup truck at the next pump. He glanced at the Harley, then at Walter. "Nice ride," he said casually. Walter gave a nod. "She's been with me a long time. You selling it?" the man asked. Walter hesitated. "Yeah, I am." The stranger shook his head slowly. "Hard thing to let go of." He didn't push further, just filled his tank and drove off, but the words sat heavy in Walter's chest. Hard thing to let go of. It was an understatement. When he got back on the road, Walter decided to swing past the Miami River, a place he used to fish with his brother before the war. He pulled over near the bank, cut the engine, and let the silence of rushing water fill his ears. He closed his eyes and prayed. Not for himself, but for Alyssa. "Lord," he whispered, "take the bike. Take my pride. Take whatever you need from me. Just give that little girl her chance." His voice cracked at the end, but there was no one there to hear it. Only the river, only the steady heartbeat of memories. After a while, he kicked the Harley back to life and rode home, taking the slower streets so he could stretch out every second. People waved at him as he passed. Neighbors, strangers, kids on bikes pretending to race him. He returned their waves with a nod, keeping his face calm, though inside it felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. When he finally pulled back into the driveway, Alyssa was still on the porch, waiting. She ran down the steps barefoot and stood next to the bike. "Was it good?" she asked. Walter took off his helmet, his eyes a little misty. "Best ride I've had in years." Alyssa touched the handlebars, looking at the Harley like it was alive. "I wish we didn't have to sell it." Walter placed a hand on her shoulder. "Some rides end sooner than you want them to, but that just means you hold tighter to the ones you got." She didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway, leaning against him. He wrapped an arm around her, steadying himself as much as her. The Harley sat silent in the driveway, the metal still warm from the ride. Walter knew it wouldn't be his for long, but in that moment, surrounded by the people who mattered most, it felt like it belonged to more than just him. But the buyer was already on his way, and Walter was about to face the hardest conversation of all. By mid-afternoon, Walter sat in his living room, staring at the clock on the wall. Each tick of the second hand carried him closer to the moment he had been dreading. The buyer had called that morning. His name was Raymond Holt, a man in his 50s from Cincinnati, who said he had always wanted a road king. His voice was polite, but carried that no-nonsense tone of someone who dealt in cash and expected things done quick. Walter rose slowly, rubbing his knees as he made his way to the garage. The Harley gleamed under the fluorescent light. He had polished it again after his ride, the leather shining as if it had been brand new. He wanted to hand it over with dignity, not neglect. Alyssa followed him out, carrying 2 mugs of sweet tea she had poured herself. "Granddad?" she said carefully. "Maybe he won't come. Maybe he'll change his mind." Walter took the glass from her, smiled faintly, and shook his head. "He'll come. People like him always keep their word when money's on the table." Not long after, the sound of tires crunching over gravel filled the driveway. Walter's chest tightened. A dark blue Chevy Suburban pulled up, and out stepped Raymond, tall, with a weathered face and work boots caked in dried mud. He looked around the small house before his eyes landed on the bike. "Beautiful," Raymond muttered as he approached. "Pictures didn't do her justice," Walter forced a smile. "She's been kept clean. No shortcuts." Raymond crouched down, inspecting the chrome, the tires, the engine. He tapped the tank lightly, listening to the hollow sound. "How many miles?" 52,000, Walter answered. "Mostly long trips. Never beat her up." Raymond stood, brushing his hands against his jeans. "And you're asking?" Walter swallowed. The price was already low, but he repeated it anyway. 8,000. Raymond tilted his head. "That's fair, though I've seen a few go for less. You know how the market is right now." Alyssa, standing off to the side, looked at her grandfather with wide eyes. Walter felt the weight of her gaze. He couldn't let this slip away. The medicine cost more than half that figure, and without it, Alyssa's future dimmed before him. "I'm not budging," Walter said firmly. 8. "Not a penny less." There was a silence, the kind of pause where 2 men measure each other. Then Raymond broke it with a small shrug. "All right. If she runs like you say, you've got yourself a deal." Walter exhaled slowly, relief and grief twisting together. He nodded toward the bike. "Take her for a spin. She'll answer for herself." Raymond swung a leg over with practiced ease. The engine roared to life under his touch, steady and smooth. He pulled down the street, the rumble fading before it returned a few minutes later. When he stopped, he had a grin stretching across his face. "She rides like a dream," he admitted, climbing off. He pulled a thick envelope from his jacket and handed it over. 8 grand just like you asked. Count it if you want." Walter took it, the paper heavier than it looked. He didn't count it. A man's word was still supposed to mean something, and Raymond seemed like the kind who knew that. Raymond extended his hand. "Pleasure doing business with you." Walter gripped it, though his fingers trembled. "Take care of her. She's carried a lot of memories." Raymond gave a short nod. "Don't worry. She'll be in good hands." As the Suburban pulled away, the Harley strapped on a trailer behind it, Walter stood in the driveway with Alyssa beside him. The roar of the engine was gone now, replaced by the quiet drone of cicadas in the trees. His chest felt hollow, as if something vital had been pulled from him. Alyssa slipped her hand into his. "Thank you, Granddad." He squeezed her fingers, his throat tightening. "Don't thank me. Just get better. That's all I need." Back inside, Walter laid the envelope on the kitchen table. His daughter, Angela Green, arrived home from her shift at the diner a short while later. Her hair was damp with sweat, and her apron smelled faintly of fried food. When she saw the money, her eyes widened. "You sold it?" she asked quietly. Walter nodded. "Guy from Cincinnati. Paid what I asked." Angela looked at him for a long moment, then crossed the room and wrapped her arms around him. "Daddy, you didn't have to do this. Yes, I did, Walter said, his voice low but steady. We do what we have to for family. Always. For a moment, the three of them stood together in the small kitchen, bound not by blood alone, but by sacrifice. The Harley was gone, but Alyssa's hope was still alive. Walter reminded himself that was the trade he had chosen to make. But what Walter didn't know was that his sacrifice had already started traveling beyond their little house, carried from one person to the next, until strangers he'd never met were about to show up at his door. The next morning, Walter sat on the front porch with a cup of black coffee, the envelope of cash locked inside the small fireproof box he kept under his bed. The street was quiet except for the sound of a lawnmower 2 houses down. His neighbor, Carl Benson, waved half-heartedly while pushing it across the yard. Carl had seen the Harley leave yesterday on the trailer. Walter could tell by his look that he knew what it meant. Angela had taken Alyssa to a doctor's appointment, so the house was still. Walter lit a cigarette, something he rarely did anymore, and let the smoke trail upward. Selling the bike had given him what the family needed, but the loss gnawed at him in silence. By noon, Walter decided to run an errand at Bill's Garage, a small shop on East 3rd Street where he had gone for years whenever the Harley needed tuning. Bill wasn't just a mechanic. He was a friend who knew the bike almost as well as Walter did. When he walked through the door, the familiar smell of motor oil and rubber filled the air. Bill looked up from under the hood of an old Chevy. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Where's the Road King?" Walter leaned on the counter. "Sold her yesterday." Bill froze, the rag hanging in his hand. "You? Sell that Harley after all these years?" "Didn't have a choice," Walter muttered. "My granddaughter's medicine. Insurance won't cover it. Needed the money." Bill's eyes softened. He set the rag down, shook his head, and sighed. "That's one hell of a sacrifice, Walter." Walter shrugged, trying to play it off. "You do what you gotta do." But later that night, after Walter had gone home, Bill couldn't shake the conversation. He told his wife at dinner. She, in turn, shared it with her sister, who happened to be married to a man running a biker forum out of Columbus. By the time the sun rose again, Walter's story had been posted online under the title, "Vietnam Vet Sells His Harley to Save Granddaughter's Life." The post was simple. 2 paragraphs explaining Walter's background, the sale of the bike, and why he had done it. No pictures, no dramatic language, just the truth, and the truth was enough. Comments started pouring in. "This man's a hero." "Heartbreaking. Somebody needs to help this family." "Respect. Sacrificing his ride for family. That's the real deal." On the second day, the story made its way onto Facebook. A local community group in Dayton picked it up. By the evening, strangers Walter had never heard of were sharing his name. Some offered donations, others prayers. A GoFundMe popped up, though Walter had nothing to do with it. Angela noticed first. She came into the kitchen holding her phone, her face pale. "Daddy," she said, "did you know people online are talking about you?" Walter raised an eyebrow. "Talking about me? For what?" She handed him the phone. He squinted at the screen, reading the words carefully. His name, his story, his granddaughter's illness. All there for anyone to see. "I didn't put this up," he muttered. "I know," Angela replied, "but people are sharing it like crazy. Look at the comments. They're calling you a hero." Walter pushed the phone back into her hand. "I'm no hero. I'm just doing what I have to." That night, Angela scrolled through more posts while Alyssa sat beside her, wide-eyed. "Granddad," Alyssa whispered. "People care about us. Look." She read aloud one comment from a man in Michigan. "This vet deserves more than applause. Somebody should bring him back a Harley." Walter shook his head, chuckling. "Internet talk. Folks say a lot online, not much in real life." But he was wrong. By the third day, the story reached a private Facebook group for bikers across the Midwest. Among those reading was Clint Morales, a longtime member of the HELLS Angels chapter in Cleveland. He read it twice, his jaw tight. The Harley wasn't just a machine. It was a brotherhood, a way of life. To think of an old vet selling his ride for family stirred something deep inside him. Clint forwarded the post to another member with a simple message. "We need to talk about this." In a matter of hours, word spread from one chapter to another. Phone calls, text chains, quiet meetings in garages. These weren't men known for charity, but they knew loyalty when they saw it. A brother who had walked the hard road of life had been forced to give up his machine. That didn't sit right with them. Meanwhile, Walter remained unaware. He spent his evenings watching reruns of old westerns with Alyssa, who curled up against him on the couch. Angela worked late shifts, and the money from the sale sat untouched in the box, waiting for the next round of medical bills. Walter assumed the world had moved on. But far from Dayton, engines were already being tuned, routes were being mapped, and a plan was forming. One that would soon bring an army of riders to Walter Green's street. 2 days after the story had begun circling online, Walter was back in his kitchen, carefully sorting his pillbox for the week. His hands shook a little more these days, arthritis setting in, the years catching up, but he refused to complain. Alyssa sat across the table, bent over her homework, pencil tapping lightly against the paper. The doorbell rang. Walter frowned. Visitors were rare. He stood slowly, joints stiff, and opened the door to find a man he didn't recognize. Mid-40s, denim vest, grey streaks in his beard. Behind him was a young woman holding a grocery bag. "Mr. Green?" the man asked. "Yes?" The man extended his hand. "Name's Eddie Ramos. This is my daughter, Marissa. We live across town. We read about you online. Didn't feel right just scrolling past. Thought we'd bring something." Walter blinked, caught off guard. Eddie held out an envelope with a few bills inside, and Marissa lifted the bag. It was filled with fresh fruit, bread, milk, and even a box of Alyssa's favorite cereal. "I can't take this," Walter said quickly, his pride prickling. "You can," Eddie replied firmly. "And you should. This ain't charity, it's community. My father rode a Harley too. When I read what you did, it reminded me of him." From the table, Alyssa called out softly, "Is that for me?" Her small voice carried curiosity and a hint of excitement. Marissa smiled and stepped forward, setting the bag on the counter. "Some of it is. My little brother loves this cereal too." Walter looked from the bag to Eddie. His instinct was to push it all back, but Alyssa's eyes were wide, brighter than he had seen them in weeks. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you. I don't know what else to say." "You don't have to say anything," Eddie replied. "Just know you're not alone." After they left, Angela came home from her shift, surprised to see new groceries on the counter. Walter explained what had happened, his voice gruff as though embarrassed. Angela touched his shoulder. "Daddy, people care. You may not want attention, but it's coming whether you like it or not." That night, more messages trickled in. A woman from Toledo wrote a letter, promising to pray for Alyssa every night. A retired Marine from Indiana mailed a $50 bill with a note. For the medicine. From one vet to another. Walter sat at the kitchen table reading them, stunned. "Why would strangers do this?" he muttered aloud. Angela glanced at him while folding laundry. "Because you did something most people wouldn't. You gave up the thing you loved most for Alyssa. That means something to people, Daddy." Alyssa chimed in, her voice soft but steady. "Maybe they see you the way I do." Walter looked up. "And how's that?" "Like a hero," she said simply. His throat tightened, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. The next morning, Walter walked to the corner store for his newspaper. The cashier, a teenager he barely knew, handed it over with a grin. "No charge today, Mr. Green. My manager said it's on us." Walter frowned. "I can pay." "I know," the boy said. "But we all read about you. Let us do this." Walter tucked the paper under his arm, walking home in silence. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He had lived his whole life with the belief that you fought your own battles, never expecting help. But now, everywhere he turned, someone was reminding him he wasn't as invisible as he thought. That afternoon, a knock came at the door again. This time, it was Bill, the mechanic who had first shared Walter's story. He stepped in without waiting to be invited, as he always had. "You're not going to believe this," Bill said, pulling out his phone. "Your story's all over these biker forums. Guys in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, even Louisville are talking about you." Walter sighed. "I didn't ask for that." "I know you didn't," Bill said. "But sometimes stories take on a life of their own. And let me tell you, Bikers don't forget stuff like this. They respect it. Walter rubbed the back of his neck. Respect doesn't buy medicine. Bill leaned forward, lowering his voice. Maybe not, but respect can move mountains. You'll see. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Walter sat on the porch with Alyssa. She leaned against him, her head resting on his arm. Do you think more people will come? She asked. Walter exhaled slowly. I don't know, baby. Maybe. Alyssa smiled faintly. I hope they do. Walter looked out at the street, quiet and still. A part of him wondered if Bill was right, if this story had grown too big to stay contained. For the first time, he felt a strange anticipation building, though he tried to shove it aside. But anticipation was turning into reality, and soon the sound outside Walter's house wouldn't be a knock on the door. It would be the thunder of dozens of engines coming for him. It started as a vibration in the distance, so faint that Walter thought it might just be a truck shifting gears on the highway. He sat on his porch with Alyssa, who was drawing in her sketchpad, when the low growl grew louder, deeper, until it rolled across the neighborhood like a storm. Birds scattered from the trees. Dogs barked. Car alarms went off down the block. Alyssa looked up, wide-eyed. Granddad, what's that? Walter straightened in his chair, gripping the armrest. The sound was too familiar to mistake. Motorcycles. Not just one, not just two. Dozens. Engines roared closer, rattling windows. Neighbors began stepping out onto porches, shading their eyes against the late afternoon sun. Curtains pulled back as people peeked from behind them. Then they appeared. One after another, motorcycles poured onto Linden Avenue, leather vests flashing patches that made some neighbors stiffen instantly. Hell's Angels. The riders moved in formation, engines synchrotesis, chrome gleaming. They lined both sides of the street, filling it completely. Bikes parked nose to tail as the engines idled, the air thick with exhaust and power. Alyssa's pencil slipped from her hand. Are they here for us? Walter stood slowly, his knees protesting. But he didn't move toward the steps. He wasn't afraid, not exactly. He had seen too much in his lifetime to flinch at the sight of men in leather. But confusion gripped him. Why here? Why now? At the center of the pack, a tall man with a shaved head and a thick beard killed his engine and swung a leg off his bike. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud. On his back, the unmistakable red and white death's head patch of the Angels. He walked toward Walter's porch, pulling off his gloves. Walter stepped down one stair, his voice steady. What do you want? The man paused at the bottom of the steps, meeting Walter's eyes without flinching. Name's Clint Morales. Cleveland chapter. We heard about you. Walter's brow furrowed. Heard what? Clint tilted his head, a hint of a smile on his lips. That you sold your Harley to keep your granddaughter alive. He glanced at Alyssa, who half hid behind Walter's arm. His tone softened. We don't let a man like you stand alone. The words hung in the air. The neighbors murmured among themselves, the fear in their eyes shifting to something else. Curiosity, disbelief. Walter narrowed his gaze. I didn't ask for help. Clint nodded. Doesn't matter. Sometimes the road brings people to your door whether you ask or not. Behind him, dozens of riders sat watching, silent except for the steady rumble of idling engines. The presence was overwhelming, almost theatrical, like a scene staged for a movie, but it was real. Too real. Angela pulled into the driveway just then, her old sedan squealing slightly as she braked hard. She jumped out, her apron still on from her shift. Daddy, what's going on? Who are these people? Clint turned toward her, raising his voice so she could hear. Mom, we're here for Walter Green. We're here because respect should be paid. Angela froze, glancing between the men and her father. Respect? I don't understand. Walter shook his head, muttering under his breath. Neither do I. Clint stepped forward, reaching into his vest. For a second, Walter tensed, unsure what was coming, but Clint pulled out a set of keys, shiny, gleaming, dangling in the sun. He held them out. Your Harley's not gone, Clint said. She's been bought back, restored, and she's yours again. Paid in full. Walter's mouth went dry. His voice barely carried. What? You heard me. Clint said calmly. Brotherhood doesn't forget. You rode the roads we ride. You sacrificed for family. That matters. Angela gasped, covering her mouth. Alyssa's eyes lit up as she whispered, Granddad, they brought it back? 2 riders wheeled forward then. And there it was. Walter's Harley, polished to a shine brighter than he had ever seen, chrome catching the sunlight like fire. A hush fell across the street as neighbors stared in awe. Walter staggered a step closer, his hands trembling. He touched the handlebars as though it were a dream. The leather seat had been repaired, the scratches buffed out, even the old scuffed saddlebag replaced. Clint's voice was steady. She's yours. Always was. Always will be. Walter shook his head slowly, overwhelmed. I can't accept this. It's too much. Clint leaned in slightly, lowering his tone. You don't get it, do you? This isn't charity. This is respect. Brotherhood. When one of us falls, the rest hold him up. Walter's throat tightened. He turned to Alyssa, who clung to Angela's hand, her face glowing with hope. He knew there was no arguing with men like these, not when they had made up their minds. Clint reached into his vest again, pulling out a second envelope. He handed it to Angela. This is for Alyssa. Cash. Enough to cover her treatments for the year. Angela's knees nearly buckled. She caught the envelope, clutching it to her chest. Why? Why would you do this for us? Clint glanced back at his men, then returned his gaze to her. Because good men don't go forgotten, and because your father's sacrifice reminded us what loyalty looks like. The engines thundered once more as the riders revved in unison, the sound shaking the street. Neighbors clapped, some even cheering, though others simply stared in disbelief. Walter placed his hand firmly on the Harley's tank, his reflection staring back at him. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart. Clint gave a curt nod. Ride her again, Walter. She's not meant to sit still. But Walter wasn't the only one shaken by what had just happened. The entire neighborhood had witnessed something unforgettable, and soon word of the HELLS Angels' appearance on Linden Avenue would spread like wildfire. The engines had quieted now, most of the HELLS Angels standing beside their bikes, arms crossed, watching the scene with steady eyes. For a moment, the neighborhood was suspended in a strange silence, half awe, half uncertainty. Children peeked from behind their parents' legs, neighbors whispered to one another, unsure whether to clap or lock their doors. Walter stood by the Harley, his palm resting against the cool chrome. But even in the middle of this surreal gift, his instincts whispered caution. Life had taught him that nothing ever came without a price. He looked up at Clint. I appreciate this. More than I can say. But you need to tell me the truth. What do you expect from me in return? The question cut through the air like a blade. Angela stiffened, her eyes darting between Clint and her father. Alyssa gripped her mother's arm, sensing the tension. Clint's face didn't change, but his tone sharpened. You think we're here to collect a debt? Walter didn't blink. I've been around long enough to know nobody rides this far without a reason. Clint studied him for a long moment, then broke into a low laugh. You've got fire, old man. I respect that. But you're wrong. We don't want a damn thing from you. Still, Walter pressed. Then why me? Why now? Clint turned slightly, gesturing to the men lined along the street. Look at them. Every one of these brothers has sacrificed something. Family, freedom, sometimes their own skin. But when we read about you, a vet who gave up his Harley to save his granddaughter, it hit us. That's the kind of loyalty we live by. That's why we're here. Before Walter could answer, another rider stepped forward, a burly man with tattoos winding down both arms. His name was Ricky Vaughan, and his eyes were sharp as he looked Walter over. Question is, Ricky said, his voice rough, do you still deserve it? That Harley, that respect? Or did you give it up because you were ready to let go? The crowd hushed. Even Alyssa held her breath. Walter straightened, shoulders back, the years of military discipline returning in an instant. I didn't sell her because I was ready to let go. I sold her because family comes first. That's not weakness. That's strength. Ricky's lips curled into a half-smile. Good answer. He looked at Clint. Man's still got steel in him. Clint nodded slowly, as though confirming something unspoken. That's what I thought, Walter exhaled. But the tension wasn't gone. He knew this was more than just a gift. This was a test. The riders weren't only giving him back his Harley, they were measuring the man himself. Angela stepped forward, her voice shaking. Look, I don't know what all this is, but my father doesn't owe you anything. He's done enough. Clint glanced at her, his expression calm. Mom, you've got it backward. He doesn't owe us. We owe him. And we're just making sure he still remembers who he is. Walter turned to Alyssa, who was staring at the riders with wide eyes. He crouched down, putting a hand on her shoulder. Don't be scared, baby. These men may look rough, but they understand loyalty better than most. Alyssa whispered, Are they your friends now? Walter smiled faintly. Something like that. Clint stepped closer again, lowering his voice so only Walter could hear. One more thing. You got to promise us you'll ride again. Don't let this bike rot in the garage. She belongs on the road, and so do you. You owe that much to yourself. Walter hesitated. His body wasn't young anymore. His knees ached, his back complained, and part of him feared the open highway. But looking into Alyssa's eyes, he realized the promise wasn't just about the Harley. It was about living, not surrendering to age or circumstance. I'll ride, Walter said firmly. Clint's grin spread wide. He turned to his brothers. You hear that? He's still one of us. A cheer erupted from the line of riders, engines revving in approval. The sound rolled down Linden Avenue like thunder, shaking the windows of every house. Angela, still clutching the envelope, looked at her father with tears in her eyes. Daddy, I've never seen anything like this. Walter placed a hand over hers. Neither have I. But sometimes life throws you the kind of test you don't see coming. The only choice is to stand tall. The riders began to mount their bikes again, preparing to leave. Clint turned back one last time, his voice carrying over the roar of engines. Ride proud, Walter Green. You're not just an old man on a Harley. You're family now. And with that, the street shook once more as the pack rolled out, engines echoing long after they were gone. Neighbors stepped back from their porches, whispering in amazement, some still holding their phones where they had recorded the entire thing. Walter stood in the driveway, staring at the Harley gleaming in the sunlight. Alyssa tugged at his sleeve. You're really going to ride again, right? He bent down and kissed the top of her head. Yeah, baby. For you, I will. But the story didn't end with their departure, because soon the neighborhood, the city and beyond would begin to feel the ripple of what had just happened on Linden Avenue. For the rest of that evening, Walter didn't leave the driveway. The Harley stood there, polished and perfect, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Neighbors drifted back inside their homes, though now and then someone peeked through a curtain, still whispering about what they had witnessed. It wasn't every day the Hells Angels filled a quiet Dayton street and left behind something good instead of fear. Angela set the thick envelope on the kitchen table, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Bills stacked high, more than she had ever seen in her life, spilled out onto the surface. She gasped, covering her mouth. Daddy, there's got to be at least 20,000 here, maybe more. Walter stepped inside, still carrying the smell of exhaust on his clothes. He looked at the money but didn't touch it. His eyes went to Alyssa instead, who had fallen asleep on the couch, her sketchpad still in her lap. Angela's voice wavered. Do you understand what this means? We don't have to scrape anymore. We don't have to worry about next month's medicine. She'll get what she needs. Walter lowered himself into a chair, his knees creaking. He rubbed his face with both hands, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. I understand, he said finally. But I also know money like this doesn't just fall out of the sky. Those men gave it for a reason. Angela frowned. You're not seriously thinking they expect something in return? I don't know, Walter admitted. All I know is nothing in life is free. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds as Alyssa bounded into the kitchen, wide awake and buzzing with energy. Granddad, is it real? Did they really bring it back? Walter smiled softly. It's out there in the driveway. Go see for yourself. She raced outside barefoot, her laughter echoing down the block. Walter followed more slowly, standing on the porch as he watched her circle the bike, her small hands brushing the gleaming chrome. She looked up at him, grinning ear to ear. "You have to ride it today," Walter chuckled, scratching the back of his neck. "Maybe. We'll see." Angela joined them with a mug of coffee in hand, her expression still uneasy. "Daddy, you should take it out. Show people you're not just holding on to it. It'll prove you're not afraid." Walter considered her words. His pride told him he didn't need to prove a thing, but Clint's voice still echoed in his ears. "She belongs on the road. And so do you." By late afternoon, Walter gave in. He strapped on his old helmet, slid into his worn leather jacket, and swung his leg over the Harley. The seat felt familiar, like home. Alyssa clapped her hands, bouncing on the porch. "Go, Granddad, go!" The engine roared to life with a growl that sent a shiver down his spine. Neighbors came out again, drawn by the sound. Some cheered, others simply watched with wide eyes. Walter eased the Harley onto the street, the wind brushing against his face as he picked up speed. His body protested, his knees stiff, his back sore, but the feeling was undeniable. Freedom surged through him again, the kind of freedom he thought he'd lost forever. He looped around the block, the bike gliding smooth as silk, before pulling back into the driveway where Alyssa and Angela were waiting. "That was amazing!" Alyssa shouted, running to his side. Walter killed the engine, pulling off his helmet. His smile was small, but real. "She rides like the day I bought her." Angela knelt to hug Alyssa, her eyes shining. "See, baby? He's still got it." Inside that night, Walter placed the Harley keys on the kitchen counter, resting his hand on top of them for a long moment. The money was still stacked in the envelope nearby, and for the first time in months, the house didn't feel heavy with worry. But Walter couldn't ignore the strange mix of emotions stirring in him. Gratitude, yes, but also disbelief, and even fear. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and he knew a story like this wouldn't stay contained to their neighborhood for long. Angela noticed his silence. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Walter looked at her, then at Alyssa, asleep on the couch again, curled under a blanket. "I keep wondering why me? Out of all the people struggling in this world, why did those men ride to my door?" Angela placed a hand over his. "Maybe because you reminded them of what loyalty really looks like. Maybe they needed to be reminded as much as you did." Walter let her words sink in, though the uneasiness never fully left him. He was grateful, overwhelmed, even humbled. But deep down, he wondered if this gift was the beginning of something larger than he could yet see. But the truth was, Walter's story was already spreading beyond Dayton, and soon reporters, neighbors, and strangers alike would demand to know more about the man whose sacrifice had brought the Hells Angels to Linden Avenue. By the end of the week, Linden Avenue no longer felt like the quiet street Walter had known for decades. It had become something else, almost a landmark. People drove slowly past his house, some snapping pictures from car windows, others parking just to walk by. A few even knocked on his door, hoping to shake his hand. The local paper ran a front-page story. "Veteran Sacrifice Brings Hells Angels to Dayton Street." The photo showed Walter standing beside the Harley, Alyssa clinging to his arm, and Angela smiling with tears in her eyes. Walter hated the attention, but Alyssa proudly clipped the article and taped it to the fridge like a trophy. At the grocery store, clerks whispered and pointed. A woman in her 60s stopped Walter by the produce aisle. "You're that veteran, aren't you? The one with the granddaughter." Walter gave a tired smile. "That's me." The woman squeezed his hand. "God bless you, sir. What you did for your family. That's what real men are made of." He nodded politely, though embarrassment colored his cheeks. To him it hadn't been heroic. It had been necessary. Meanwhile, at Alyssa's school, teachers and classmates began treating her differently. Kids who had once ignored her illness now offered to carry her books or sit with her at lunch. Some did it awkwardly, some sincerely, but Alyssa noticed the change. At dinner one night, she looked at Walter and said, "They all think you're famous now." Walter chuckled, setting down his fork. "I don't need to be famous. I just need you to get well." Angela, though grateful for the help, worried about the spotlight. She confided in her father one evening as they washed dishes together. Daddy, I don't want Alyssa growing up thinking people will always swoop in to save her. Life doesn't usually work that way. Walter nodded slowly, rinsing a plate. You're right, but maybe this is one of those rare times when the world shows up the way it ought to. Doesn't mean it'll happen again, but it's a reminder of what's possible. Across town, in places Walter didn't even know, his story kept circulating. A bar in Cleveland held a fundraiser, bikers tossing cash into a jar labeled "For Walter's Girl." A veterans group in Indiana sent a framed letter thanking him for his service and his sacrifice. Even a church in Pittsburgh mailed a card signed by dozens of members, each promising prayers for Alyssa. Yet not everyone saw it kindly. One evening, Walter overheard two men at the gas station muttering as he paid for his fuel. "Guy's just milking it," one said under his breath. "Yeah," the other replied. "Probably staged the whole thing. Hell's Angels don't do charity." Walter said nothing. He climbed onto his Harley, the engine drowning out their voices. Still, the words stayed with him. That night, on the porch with Alyssa, he asked her, "Do you think people really believe in what happened here?" She tilted her head. "Why wouldn't they?" "Because some folks can't stand to see good things without tearing them down," Walter muttered. Alyssa thought for a moment, then smiled softly. "Doesn't matter what they think. I know the truth. You know the truth." "That's enough." Walter looked at her, pride swelling in his chest. She was young, but her words carried wisdom. In the weeks that followed, Walter found himself approached by local reporters. Some wanted interviews. Others asked him to appear at community events. He declined most of them. Fame wasn't what he wanted. He had made his sacrifice quietly, and he wished it had stayed that way. But late one Sunday morning, after church, the pastor asked Walter to share a few words. He resisted at first, but the congregation's eyes were on him, waiting. Finally, he stood, leaning on the back of the pew for support. "I didn't sell my bike for glory," he began, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "I sold it because my granddaughter needed medicine. That's it. Any one of you would have done the same. Family comes first. Always." He paused, then added, "What those riders did, it shocked me. But it reminded me that the world still has room for loyalty, for respect, for brotherhood. And maybe that's the lesson. We don't get to choose when the road tests us, but we do get to choose how we answer. I chose family." The room was silent for a moment before applause swelled, filling the space. Walter sat down again, his hands trembling, but a peace settling over him. Angela leaned in, whispering, "That was beautiful, Daddy." Walter shrugged, a half-smile tugging at his lips. Just the truth. As weeks turned into months, the Harley remained parked in the garage, though Walter rode it often, short trips, long enough to feel the wind again, short enough not to strain his body. Each time, Alyssa waved from the porch, cheering him on. The neighborhood never forgot that day when the angels filled the street. Some remembered it with awe, others with unease, but everyone agreed it had changed something. But for Walter, the greatest change wasn't in the neighborhood, it was inside himself. And as he sat alone one evening, the Harley keys in his hand, he knew the time had come to reflect on what it all truly meant. The house was quiet that night. Angela had gone to bed early after another long shift, and Alyssa had fallen asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked up to her chin and her sketchpad sliding from her lap. Walter sat at the kitchen table alone, the Harley keys resting in front of him. He turned them over in his palm, listening to the faint metallic clink as they hit the wood. For a long while, he just stared at them. Not at the chrome or the leather they represented, but at what they meant. He thought about Vietnam, about the brothers he'd lost there, and how they had lived and died by loyalty. He thought about Denise, his late wife, who used to call the Harley his other love, and he thought about Alyssa, who had no idea that her laughter and her smile were worth more than 1,000 motorcycles. When he finally spoke, it was to the empty room. "Funny thing about sacrifice," he murmured. "You give up something thinking it's gone forever, but sometimes it comes back to you, bigger than before." The following Sunday, Walter decided to take Alyssa for a short ride. She had been begging for weeks, and Angela, though nervous, finally agreed after seeing the joy it brought her daughter just thinking about it. Walter strapped a small helmet onto Alyssa's head, adjusted the chin strap, and helped her climb onto the back seat. "Hold on tight," he said with a wink. Her arms wrapped around his waist, and for a moment, Walter felt 30 years younger. The Harley growled to life, neighbors stepping outside again as the pair rolled down Linden Avenue. The wind caught Alyssa's laughter, carrying it down the block, and Walter couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't just a ride. It was proof that the sacrifices he had made were worth it. Back home, Alyssa hopped off, her cheeks flushed pink from the wind. "Granddad, that was the best day of my life," she shouted, running into the yard to tell Angela every detail. Walter parked the Harley in the driveway, leaning against it with his arms folded. For the first time in years, he didn't feel old. He felt alive. Later that evening, a neighbor named Mrs. Whitfield, who had lived 2 doors down for decades, came by with a pie. She pressed it into Walter's hands with tears in her eyes. "I've seen you ride that bike for years, Mr. Green," she said. "I thought it was just a hobby, but after what happened, I realized it was something much deeper. You reminded all of us that family is worth more than pride." Walter nodded, his voice soft. "It's not about the bike. It's about who you ride for." Word of his statement spread almost as quickly as the original story. Local news quoted him, churches repeated it in sermons, and even a few biker forums adopted it as a motto. It's not about the bike. It's about who you ride for. In the weeks that followed, Walter found himself reflecting more and more. He realized that life had a way of testing you when you least expected it. Sometimes the test came in the form of war, sometimes in loss, and sometimes in the quiet decision to sell the thing you loved most. The measure of a man wasn't in what he kept, but in what he was willing to give. And in giving, he had received more than he ever thought possible: respect, community, and a reminder that even in a divided world, there were still people ready to stand together for what mattered. One night, sitting on the porch with Angela and Alyssa, Walter said it plainly. "This whole thing, it wasn't about me. It was about what happens when people see loyalty and sacrifice and decide to answer it with kindness. That's the lesson I want Alyssa to carry with her. Not that her granddad was a hero, but that no matter how hard life gets, there's always someone out there willing to stand with you." Angela squeezed his hand. Alyssa curled up against him, half asleep, her small hand clutching the edge of his jacket. Walter looked out at the quiet street, remembering the roar of engines that had once filled it, and he whispered a final thought. Sometimes, brotherhood comes from the people you least expect. And that was the truth. Because sacrifice, loyalty, and love weren't just words. They were choices. Choices that defined a life. And so, if you're listening to Walter's story right now, remember this. Life will test you. It will put you in situations where you're asked to give up something precious. Don't fear it. Don't run from it, because the things you give out of love have a way of returning tenfold. Walter's sacrifice wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a lesson that spread far beyond Dayton, Ohio, touching strangers, neighbors, and riders alike. And maybe it can touch you too. So ask yourself, who do you ride for? If Walter's story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of sacrifice and the beauty of loyalty, then let this be more than just another video you watched. Carry it with you, share it, and most importantly, don't forget to subscribe so you can hear more stories that remind us all what truly matters. Because sometimes the smallest acts of sacrifice can spark the loudest echoes of kindness.